Luda University presents How to Give Constructive Scholarly Feedback. I am Professor Lolita Buckner-Innes of the Southern Methodist University Dedman School of Law. I'm proposing a three-step process for feedback, which can be summarized using the letters RIF or RIF. Restate what the paper is saying, identify the paper's scholarly intervention, and finally, offer constructive feedback. Let's start with restate what the paper says. You want to first determine what the mode or venue of the paper is. Is it a law review article, a peer-reviewed article, or a book chapter? Next, you want to discuss the central arguments of the paper. You want to describe the thesis, talk about how the thesis is developed, and determine what evidence or support the author uses to support her thesis. Next, you want to identify the author's scholarly intervention. There are many types of scholarly intervention. Here are just some of them. First, ask whether the author proposes a new take on a well-established empirical claim, a line of reasoning, or doctrine. Next, you want to determine whether or not the author is reorganizing or reinterpreting a doctrinal field. You might also ask whether or not the author is intervening in a debate about social policy based on new evidence or a new approach. Next, consider whether the author is intervening in a theoretical or political debate on the basis of new evidence or a new approach. Next, consider whether the author is aligning interdisciplinary areas. This would mean, for example, looking at law and humanities, law and science, law and psychology, etc. Next, consider whether the paper is intended to be comparative, and this could mean comparative in terms of national jurisprudential or legal systems, comparative doctrines, or comparative theoretical approaches. Finally, but certainly not in sum, consider whether or not the author is taking a historical approach, whether she is telling, retelling, or reinterpreting a particular aspect of legal history or historiography. And again, note that these are only some types of scholarly interventions. Feedback is perhaps one of the most important things that you provide to the authors of papers that you review. First, suggest how the author might state her thesis if she hasn't stated one, or clarify that thesis if she has. Next, suggest ways for the author to reorganize the paper to make her thesis or her intervention clearer. There are a couple of methods for doing this. One of them is what I call the reverse engineering approach. Take the first and last sentences of each paragraph, list them out separately, and ask whether or not you have a clear and coherent outline of the entire paper. If not, then you might suggest to the author some reorganization. Another way of reorganizing the paper or testing whether or not it needs reorganization would be make the conclusion first and then ask yourself how the paper reads. If it still reads clearly, then that tends to be an indication that the paper is well organized. If the conclusion somehow comes out of nowhere and is not a parallel with the materials at the beginning, then you might want to suggest reorganization for the author. Next, you want to offer objections that are likely to be raised by other reviewers or editors, and most importantly here, you want to suggest responses. It is of little use to simply pull out objections without helping the author to address them. Next, to the extent that you yourself are well versed in the doctrinal area that the paper addresses, you want to propose other relevant literature. Next, you want to propose improvements to the author's method. For example, does the author reach macro conclusions from micro evidence, or does she do the reverse? Are there unexamined alternate conclusions, or are methods appropriate to the thesis or goal? Finally, you want to be sure to keep your comments positive and helpful and avoid proposing new topics, proposing new approaches, or discussing how you or someone else would approach this paper. Finally, read the paper with a critical eye, but also read it to learn. Ask yourself at the end, what did I learn? That concludes this discussion of how to give constructive scholarly feedback. Thank you for